He was standing in a line that stretched farther than the eye could follow, a line of wagons and horses and men on foot, a line of women holding babies. When the signal came, he would have 60 minutes, maybe less, to ride into a territory he had never seen and stake a claim to a piece of ground he had never walked. 160 acres, free. A whole life, a farm, a town lot, a chance. What would you do if the starting gun of a nation's future fired across the prairie at high noon, and the ground on the other side of that line had, only weeks before, belonged to someone else? This is the story of the Oklahoma Land Run of 1889, and it is the story of what it actually cost. Welcome back to Western Pioneer Archives, where we tell the real stories behind the myths of the American frontier. If you're new here, subscribe so the next episode finds you. And as you watch, we'd like to hear from you in the comments. If you had been standing on that line at noon on April 22nd, would you have run? Would you have stayed? What would you have been willing to risk for 160 acres of another people's land? Because that is the question the Oklahoma Land Run forces us to ask. And the answer is never as clean as the old photographs make it look. For most of the 19th century, the strip of country that would become the state of Oklahoma had a name that most Americans recognized, but few understood. It was called the Indian Territory, and in the imagination of the white settler pushing westward from Missouri and Kansas and Texas, it was a strange, restricted place, a section of the map that the government had set aside, a section where the rules of the Homestead Act did not apply, a section where a man could not simply file a claim and break the sod and make a farm. That was precisely the point. The Indian Territory was not supposed to be settled by white Americans. It had been promised in treaty after treaty stretching back to the 1830s to native nations forced west from their homelands in the southeast. Congress had authorized the creation of the territory in 1834 during the administration of President Andrew Jackson, and the lands were set aside as a permanent home for peoples the United States government had decided, by one means or another, to remove. The Choctaw came first, beginning in 1830. The Creek followed by 1836, after armed conflict and what amounted to civil war within their own nation. The Cherokee were forced west at the end of the 1830s on what their descendants would remember as the Trail of Tears, a journey on which, of roughly 18,000 people who traveled between 1835 and 1838, about 4,000 died. The Chickasaw crossed in the winter of 1837 and 1838, paying the Choctaw for the right to settle on a portion of their land. The Seminole came last and came hardest, after years of bloody resistance in the swamps of Florida. Together, these nations, the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Muskogee Creek, and the Seminole, came to be known in the language of the United States government as the 5 Civilized Tribes. It was a name the federal authorities gave them because they had adopted, or been forced to adopt, certain practices that Americans of European descent recognized. Written constitutions, Christian churches, formal schools, centralized governments, written languages, the cultivation of cotton on the model of southern plantations, and, disturbingly, in some cases, the ownership of enslaved African people. The term civilized carried all the ethnocentrism of the century that coined it. It measured native peoples by the degree to which they resembled the white society that was taking their land. But the term stuck, and it is the term the United States Congress itself used in its laws, and so it is the term we will encounter again and again as this story unfolds. To these 5 tribes were added, over the decades that followed, dozens more. The Shawnee and the Lenape and the Kickapoo came down from the upper Midwest, The Quapaw and the Seneca were settled in the northeast corner of the territory, beside the Cherokee. After the annexation of Texas in 1846, the Caddo and the Kiowa and portions of the Comanche were driven north into the Indian Territory from the south. By 1880, the Wyandot and the Cheyenne and the Arapaho and the Wichita and a dozen other smaller nations had been relocated there as well. The territory became a kind of mosaic of displaced peoples, each nation with its own lands, its own government, its own language, its own long memory of where it had come from and what it had lost to reach this place. And in the middle of that mosaic, on the prairies of what is today central Oklahoma, there was a stretch of country that belonged by treaty to no one. 2 million acres of rolling grassland, cut by the Cimarron and the Canadian and the North Canadian rivers, crossed by the Santa Fe Railroad running south from Kansas to Texas. It was land that had originally been held by the Creek and the Seminole. But after the Civil War, the United States had forced those two nations to cede large portions of their territory as punishment for the alliances some of their leaders had made with the Confederacy. The ceded acres were never reassigned to another tribe. They sat on the federal maps as a blank, an island of unassigned country in the middle of the Indian Territory, officially designated the Unassigned Lands. To white Americans watching from Kansas and Missouri and Texas in the years after the Civil War, those 2 million acres began to look like something else entirely. They looked like opportunity. They looked, in the language of the day, like wasted ground, empty, unfarmed, unfenced, available. That was not how the 5 tribes saw them. Those lands were part of a treaty system that had been paid for again and again in forced marches and buried children and signed promises. But the settlers gathering on the border did not read treaties. They read newspapers, and the newspapers in the years after 1870 began to fill with reports, some true, some fabricated, many of them planted by railroad companies hungry to sell town lots along their rails, that the unassigned lands were about to be opened, that Congress was about to act, that a man who was ready, who knew where to be and when, could claim a farm in a country that was about to become the last great prize of the American frontier. That hunger, the hunger of a nation for one more run of free land, would take almost 20 years to translate into law. It would take the lives of the men who agitated for it. It would take the patience of settlers who crossed the line and were thrown out by cavalry again and again for the better part of a decade. It would take the ruthless maneuvering of railroad interests who understood that a town with no settlers and no farmers was a town with no ticket sales. And it would take, in the end, a direct act of Congress, the Indian Appropriations Act of 1889, with its crucial amendment drafted by a bespectacled Illinois congressman named William McKendree Springer, before the blank on the map could be turned into a line on the ground and a starting gun could be loaded. The line they drew was 2 million acres wide. It ran across central Oklahoma along the borders of what would soon become the counties of Logan and Oklahoma and Cleveland and Canadian and Kingfisher and Payne. On the maps of the Interior Department, it was called a simple administrative boundary. To the people who stood along it on the morning of April 22nd, 1889, it was something else. It was the last starting line, so it seemed, of the American frontier. It was the edge of the world. And behind that line, on the cold mornings of early spring, more than 50,000 people were already waiting. They came from everywhere. They came from the broken farms of Kansas, where drought and grasshoppers had destroyed more than one season. They came from Missouri and Iowa and Arkansas. They came from the gas-lit cities of the East, drawn by advertisements in immigrant newspapers that promised a free farm and a new life. They came from the black communities of the post-Reconstruction South, hunted by night riders and crushed by sharecropping contracts, hoping that in a new country they might build towns where their children could live free. They came from overseas, from Germany and Ireland and the Scandinavian countries, and from the Russian Empire, with papers that identified them as prospective citizens, enough under the Homestead Act to file for their own 160 acres. They came on trains and in wagons, on horseback and on foot. Some had families, some had only the clothes they wore and a grub stake stitched into a coat. And they came, all of them, with the same hope. It was the hope that the Homestead Act of 1862, the great, flawed, consequential law signed by Abraham Lincoln during the darkest days of the Civil War, would finally be applied to this last great stretch of the public domain. The law was simple on its face. Any adult citizen or any immigrant who had declared the intention to become a citizen, who had never taken up arms against the United States, could claim a quarter section of public land, 160 acres. If they lived on it for 5 years and improved it, if they built a house, broke the ground, raised a crop, the land was theirs. They could pay a $10 filing fee and receive a patent in the name of the United States government. They could own, outright, a piece of the country. It was a promise that had opened up more than 160 million acres of the West by the time the unassigned lands were on the verge of being released. It was a promise that would eventually grant title to about 1.5 million homesteaders. It was also a promise that carried inside it, unspoken, the systematic dispossession of native peoples. The land the Homestead Act distributed had been taken. The historical record is plain about that. Native Americans themselves could not file homestead claims unless they renounced their tribal citizenship. The 5 tribes, for the moment, remained exempt from the Dawes Act of 1887, which was already breaking up tribal holdings across the rest of the West. But the exemption would not last, and the unassigned lands in the spring of 1889 were about to become the largest single Homestead Act opening in American history. At high noon on April 22nd, a rider on a gray horse, or a soldier with a rifle, or a bugler on a railroad platform, somewhere along that 2-million-acre line, would give the signal, and 50,000 people would ride for their lives. Not all of them would make it. Not all of them would keep what they claimed. Some of them, it turned out, were already across the line, hiding in the brush, waiting for the noon hour to pretend they had only just arrived. The term for those men and women, the ones who jumped early, would become, within a generation, the name of an entire state. They called them Sooners. And to understand what happened on April 22nd, you have to understand how the whole country got to that line. You have to understand the men and women who spent 15 years pushing across it illegally, getting arrested and pushing across again. You have to understand the cattlemen who poisoned one of their leaders. You have to understand the Illinois congressman who wrote the amendment that finally opened the ground. You have to understand the black community leaders who believed, for one brief and vanishing moment, that this might be the last and greatest chance to build a state of their own. And you have to understand the native nations on whose old treaty lands all of it would be built. The Oklahoma Land Run was a race, but it was not the race the folklore remembers. It was a race at the end of a long, slow, brutal political process. And the starting line had been drawn in blood before any rider ever put a spur to a horse. The first man to understand what the unassigned lands represented and what it would take to pry them open was a Kansas farmer and former Union soldier named David L. Payne. He was not a thoughtful man by the standards of his enemies. He was a loud man, a large man, a man who could speak for an hour on a wooden porch to a crowd of settlers and convince them by the sheer momentum of his voice that the government was wrong, that the treaties were nullified, and that 2 million acres of the finest farming country in the United States were theirs for the taking if only they would be brave enough to cross the line and stay across it. He had been born in Indiana, had served in the Kansas militia during the Civil War, and had drifted into the Kansas state legislature for a brief term in the late 1870s. By 1879, he had found his cause. It was the same cause being promoted at almost exactly the same moment by men like Elias C. Boudinot, a Cherokee lawyer who had begun controversially to argue that the unassigned lands were part of the federal public domain and were therefore subject to homesteading like any other. Boudinot's argument was amplified by men like C.C. Carpenter, who was hired by railroad interests to spread the claim through the newspapers of Kansas and Missouri. The railroads had a direct financial stake in settlement. They had been granted the right to lay track in 40-mile-wide sections on either side of the Indian Territory, beginning in 1866. They had built lines that now ran from Arkansas City in southern Kansas all the way down to Gainesville, Texas, cutting straight through the middle of the country they wanted opened. Empty prairie did not fill boxcars. Only farms filled boxcars. Only towns filled passenger cars. And so the railroads, especially the Santa Fe, began to finance, directly and indirectly, the movement that called itself the Boomers. The name came from the thundering speeches and the boom of agitation. Between 1870 and 1879, historians have documented 33 separate bills were introduced in the United States Congress to open some portion of the Indian Territory to settlement. All 33 failed. The opposition came from congressmen like George T. Barnes of Georgia and Charles E. Hooker of Mississippi, who argued, correctly, that the lands had been promised to the Indian nations and that the federal government had no moral right to open them. It also came from Colonel G.W. Harkins of the Chickasaw Nation, who traveled to Washington to argue on behalf of the tribes themselves. But opposition in Congress was one thing. Opposition on the ground, along a 2-million-acre line that the Army could not continuously patrol, was quite another. David Payne understood this, and he did what the quiet diplomats and the tribal lawyers could not do. He led men across the line. He called his organization the Oklahoma Colony. For a minimum membership fee of $1, sometimes more, a settler could join. Once the Boomers had established themselves on the ground, they would organize as a town site company and sell lots at prices that ranged from $2 to $25, depending on demand. It was a structure of collective trespass built on the assumption that occupation would create law, that if enough people crossed the line and planted corn and built cabins, the federal government would be forced to validate what they had done. Payne led expeditions in 1880 and 1881 and 1882 and 1883. Each time, the United States Army, operating under direct orders from Presidents Rutherford B. Hayes and Chester Arthur, met the Boomers, arrested them, and marched them back across the Kansas border. They were rarely tried. The government did not want the publicity. They were simply released and told to go home. And Payne would go home and rest and gather another column of men and come again. His followers thought he was a hero. His enemies thought he was something else. The cattlemen, especially, hated him. For the better part of 2 decades, the great ranching outfits had been leasing portions of the Indian Territory from the tribes, running hundreds of thousands of head of Texas longhorns on the open grass. The cattle barons did not want homesteaders in the country. Homesteaders meant fences. Fences meant the end of the open range. And David Payne, with his speeches and his colonies and his endless columns of boomers crossing the line, was exactly the sort of man who would bring fences. On the night of November 27, 1884, Payne sat down to a late supper in a hotel in Wellington, Kansas. He ate, he drank a glass of milk, and in the early hours of November 28th, he died. The Kansas newspapers of the day reported the cause as heart failure, but within weeks the rumor had taken hold among the boomers that Payne had been poisoned. Contemporary reports, preserved in the historical record, record the suspicion that cattlemen, unhappy with the success of the boomer movement, had arranged for poison to be placed in his milk. The historical record does not prove the charge. It also does not disprove it. What it does prove is this: at the moment Payne was buried, the movement he had built was leaderless, and the cattle interests could reasonably have believed they had won. They had not won. A lieutenant of Payne's stepped forward. His name was William L. Couch. Couch was not the man Payne had been. He did not shake a crowd the way Payne had shaken them. He was quieter, steadier. A man who had spent the years of agitation reading every treaty and every court case and every statute that bore on the question of Oklahoma. Where Payne had roared, Couch argued. He assembled legal briefs. He organized conferences. He understood that the movement could not survive on noise alone. It needed law. And so, from the spring of 1885 forward, Couch began to rebuild the boomer effort along different lines. He sent delegates, men like Sidney Clark and Samuel Crocker, to Washington. He pressed Congress directly. He worked increasingly with the Santa Fe Railroad, whose new line across the Indian Territory had just been completed and whose management now had every incentive to see the unassigned lands opened. For a moment, in the spring of 1887, it seemed that the completion of the Santa Fe line would be enough. Surely, the boomers reasoned, now that a railroad physically ran through the heart of the country, Congress would act. Surely the economic logic was undeniable. They were wrong. Congress did not act. The summer of 1887 passed without legislation. The autumn passed. By December, the boomer movement, which had begun to slow, was forced back into motion by Couch himself. He called another conference in Kansas. He prepared another bill. He traveled again to Washington. And there, for the first time, his lobbying encountered a congressman who was willing to take the proposition seriously. His name was William McKendree Springer. He was a Democrat from Illinois. He was 51 years old, and he was chairman of the House Committee on Territories. Springer had been born near New Lebanon, Indiana, in the spring of 1836. He had moved west with his parents to Jacksonville, Illinois, in 1848. He had attended Illinois College, where he had made himself famous, or infamous, as an undergraduate by defending Stephen A. Douglas and the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the law that had opened so much of the plains to the slavery question in the decade before the Civil War. He had finished a master's degree at Indiana University in 1858. He had read the law. He had been admitted to the bar. He had served as secretary of the Illinois Constitutional Convention of 1862. He had been elected to Congress in 1874 and had been re-elected without interruption for 9 two-year terms. By the time Couch and the boomers came to him in the winter of 1887, Springer had 12 years of experience chairing powerful House committees. He understood the mechanics of legislation. He understood, more importantly, what could be attached to what. He was also, by the reckoning of some contemporaries, a difficult man, quarrelsome, partisan, a defender of lost causes. Years earlier, during the Civil War, he had objected to the constitutionality of the income tax, a position that led to the Supreme Court case of Springer versus United States. But on the question of Oklahoma, Springer's instincts lined up with the boomer movement. He believed the unassigned lands should be opened. He believed the Homestead Act, that old law of his fellow Illinoisan Abraham Lincoln, should be applied. What Springer understood, what Couch and the boomers working through him now understood, was that a standalone bill to open the unassigned lands would never pass. The opposition from the Indian nations and from sympathetic congressmen was too strong. It had defeated 33 previous attempts, but an amendment attached to a larger appropriations bill that had to pass, a bill that funded the very operations of the Indian Bureau, was a different matter. Congress could not easily vote down the funding of an entire department of government. And inside that must-pass bill, an amendment authorizing the president to open the unassigned lands for settlement might slip through. The tactic worked. Not at first. The original Springer bill, introduced in 1888, was bogged down in arguments over how the Creek and Seminole nations were to be compensated for the ceded lands. The session ended without passage, but Couch pressed on through the following year. The amendment was reintroduced, and in the winter of 1888 and 1889, with the great national argument over the closing of the frontier reaching its full pitch, the Springer Amendment attached itself to the Indian Appropriations Act of 1889. On March 2, 1889, just 2 days before he left office, President Grover Cleveland signed the act into law. It is one of the lesser-known ironies of American history that the law which opened the Oklahoma land rush was signed by a Democratic president who left office 2 days later. But the proclamation that actually opened the lands was issued by the incoming Republican Benjamin Harrison. Cleveland signed the act. Harrison fired the starting gun. The newspapers, then and now, have almost always given Harrison the full credit. The historical record is more careful. Cleveland signed on March 2nd. Harrison was inaugurated on March 4th. And on March 23rd, 3 weeks into his presidency, Harrison issued the proclamation that set the date. The unassigned lands of the Indian Territory, he announced, would be opened for settlement at high noon on April 22, 1889. There was another provision in the act that mattered enormously to the people who would soon gather on the line. The law paid compensation to the Creek and Seminole nations $1,912,952.02 in exchange for 2,370,414 62 acres of unassigned land. That was, on paper, something close to 81 cents per acre. It was the price that finally made the opening possible. But the Creek and Seminole chiefs who signed away the ceded lands did so under the same pressure that had accompanied every treaty the United States had ever written with a native people in the 19th century. They were not negotiating from strength. They were negotiating from the knowledge that if they did not sign, the land was going to be taken anyway. There was also, buried in the original version of the law, a clause that would become famous. It declared that any person who entered the unassigned lands before the legal time of entry would be denied the rights to any lands they claimed. In the plainer language of the plainer men who lived near the border, those early trespassers had a name. They were called Sooners. The clause was called the Sooner Clause, and it was, from the moment it was written, a clause that hundreds of people intended to break, because the pressure to be first had become enormous. By the time Harrison's proclamation appeared in the Kansas and Texas papers in late March, the news of the opening had spread across the country. Every train that arrived at the Santa Fe stations of Arkansas City and Purcell, at the northern and southern approaches to the unassigned lands, carried another crowd of hopeful homesteaders. Hotels filled up. Livery stables filled up. Fields outside the railroad towns turned into temporary cities of tents and wagons. Food prices soared. A cup of coffee could cost, by one later account, $0.25. A decent horse doubled in value in 10 days. The settlers arriving from farther east were paying for everything they needed and paying twice what it was worth. And they did not care, because on the other side of that line, a quarter section of the best farming ground in the United States was waiting. Not everyone arriving was white. The spring of 1889 was a moment of genuine hope for a large number of African American families, particularly in the South. The Reconstruction era had collapsed a decade earlier. The promise of 40 acres and a mule had never been honored. The great exoduster migration to Kansas had crested in 1879 and had mostly disappointed the hopes of those who had made it. But now, in Oklahoma, there was a new possibility. A man named W.L. Eagleson ran an organization called the Oklahoma Immigration Organization, and he pushed a message across the black newspapers of the South. The unassigned lands could be the site of a new black refuge. Perhaps some of the leaders hoped Oklahoma could be made into a black state. An even more ambitious plan emerged around a former Kansas state auditor named Edward Preston McCabe. There were serious proposals to have McCabe appointed by President Harrison as the territorial governor, a move that would have been unprecedented in American history. The proposal failed. McCabe would eventually settle for a far smaller role as treasurer of Logan County in the new Oklahoma. But the black hope for a state of their own was not, in the winter and spring of 1889, a fringe hope. It was a real one, and it drew thousands of black settlers to the Kansas border. They gathered alongside the white homesteaders. They gathered alongside the European immigrants with their citizenship papers and their thick accents and their patched coats. They gathered alongside the single women, and there were many more of them than the folklore remembers, who had come to claim their own 160 acres under the Homestead Act, a law that had, from the beginning, allowed unmarried female heads of household to file. They gathered alongside the Civil War veterans, black and white, whose service qualified them to claim land even before they reached the age of 21. They gathered alongside the Union soldiers detailed by the United States Army to patrol the line, to keep the peace, and to prevent, so the Army hoped, any man or woman from crossing over before the legal hour. The Army could not prevent everything. In the weeks before the run, cavalry patrols found dozens of men already inside the unassigned lands. They found them hiding in the timber along the Cimarron. They found them camped in the folds of the prairie where the smoke of their cook fires could not be seen from the skyline. They found them along the Santa Fe tracks, where the rail workers themselves were accused of providing information about the best claims. The soldiers marched the intruders out, and more intruders came in. By the second week of April, it was an open secret that a portion of the run, perhaps a substantial portion, would be decided not by speed on horseback on the 22nd, but by who was already in place when the noon hour struck. That knowledge gnawed at the settlers camped on the northern line. It gnawed at them more than the weather, which was cold for the season, more than the prices, which were ruinous, more than the crowd, which was larger than anyone had expected. They had come for a fair chance, and they had begun to suspect that the chance was not going to be fair. At night, around the campfires strung along the Santa Fe tracks for miles, men stared south across the darkness of the unassigned lands and wondered who was already there. On April 21st, the United States Army made its final preparations. Cavalry detachments moved up along the line. Officers were assigned to the official starting points. The two federal land offices that would receive the claims, one at Guthrie, one at Kingfisher, were staffed and stocked with forms. The Santa Fe Railroad organized its special trains, scheduled to move down through the unassigned lands at a speed that would be regulated on explicit orders from Washington so that no train could outrun a man on horseback. Every provision was in place. The settlers on the line, now estimated at more than 50,000 strong, lit their cook fires in the gathering dusk. They fed their horses, they checked their wagons, they listened to the wind. They tried, most of them, to sleep. Tomorrow at noon, they would ride. The morning of April 22nd, 1889, broke cold and clear over the Kansas Indian Territory border. There had been rain in the previous days, but the ground was firm again. The wind was out of the south, which meant that the riders on the northern line were about to run into it. Breakfast fires were small and practical. The men who had horses fit to make the dash had fed those horses extra grain the night before and were now checking saddle girths and bridle fittings one last time. The men who had wagons, families mostly, were less concerned with speed than with endurance, because they would not be claiming the most contested quarter sections near the railroad. They would be looking for ground a little farther out, a little less desirable, a little more likely to still be available to a man whose team could not outrun a man on a thoroughbred. There were, as best the Army could count, more than 50,000 people arrayed along the borders of the unassigned lands that morning. The number is approximate. The contemporary estimate was 50,000, though some historians later put it as high as 100,000, when the uncounted watchers, the waiting newspaper reporters, the speculators, and the hangers-on were included. The main concentrations were at 3 points. On the north, at Arkansas City in Kansas, where the Santa Fe line crossed the border, and all along the line eastward from there. On the south, at Purcell, a small settlement on the Santa Fe line just below the Canadian River. And on the east, along the southern boundary of the Cherokee Outlet, where boomers had been encamped for weeks. There were also crossings prepared farther west, toward Kingfisher. At each crossing, United States cavalry troopers were posted to hold the line until the appointed hour. The line itself, on the morning of the 22nd, was a peculiar thing to behold. On either side of a Santa Fe Railroad crossing at the northern border, a journalist for Harper's Weekly later wrote, "There stood a crowd like none he had ever seen, men in every conceivable form of dress, some on work horses, some on plow horses pressed into service, some on fine saddle mounts, some in buckboards and buggies and freight wagons, some with their wives beside them and their children wedged in among the belongings. There were men on foot who intended to run the first quarter mile and trust to luck to find a quarter section close to the border. There were a small number of bicycle riders, improbably, who believed a bicycle would outrun a wagon on the packed prairie. There were, according to the photographs that survive, a handful of wagons that had been jury-rigged with sails, on the theory that a south wind might be an advantage on the overland route, a theory that the south wind that day would quickly disprove. Most of all, there was the noise of horses shifting and nickering, the noise of wagon wheels creaking as teamsters made final adjustments, the noise of men shouting to one another, some of them offering last-minute consolations to friends, some of them brokering last-minute deals to divide claims, to share equipment, to watch each other's children if the run went badly. There was the noise of the soldiers holding their horses in line, calling times to one another across the intervals. There was the occasional sharp bark of a sergeant correcting a trooper whose animal had gotten out of place. And underneath all of it, there was a kind of pressure, a held-breath tension that hung over the whole line as the morning wore on. The Army had been given explicit instructions. The run would begin at 12 o'clock noon. Not a minute sooner. At each major crossing, the signal would be given by a designated officer. At some crossings, it would be a bugle call. At others, a rifle shot. At still others, a simple drop of a flag. The troopers in the line had been ordered to maintain their positions until the signal was given, and to shoot, in theory, at any man who crossed before it. No trooper would actually shoot a settler that day, but the threat was real, and the settlers believed it. At 11 o'clock, along the northern line, an army officer's voice rose above the crowd. 1 hour. 1 hour to noon. The announcement rippled down the line, carried from wagon to wagon, from rider to rider, for miles. Men who had been sitting stood. Men who had been standing checked their saddles once more. Women who had been nursing infants in wagons handed the babies to relatives or to strangers. Children were told firmly to hold on. The wind was still south, and the dust of 50,000 restless people hung over the whole line. At 11:30, a second announcement. 30 minutes. It is difficult, at the distance of more than a century, to fully reconstruct what the last half hour felt like. The contemporary accounts are fragmentary. Some men remembered praying. Some remembered checking their revolvers one more time. Not because they intended to shoot another settler, but because the country ahead was unknown, and they did not know what they would find. Some remembered an almost unbearable silence that settled over the crowd in the final 5 minutes, broken only by the occasional stamp of a horse's foot. The Harper's weekly correspondent, watching from the Santa Fe train that would later carry passengers into the territory, wrote that the assembled crowd by that point had become a single organism, leaning forward into the noon hour, waiting to be released. At 12 o'clock, the signals came. At Arkansas City, it was a rifle shot, fired into the air by a cavalry officer. At other crossings, it was a bugle. At still others, a flag. At every point along the 2-million-acre line, within seconds of one another, the signal was given and the line dissolved. 50,000 people, or something close to it, surged forward at once. The noise was reportedly audible for miles. The thunder of hooves, and the crack of whips, and the shouting of men, and the cry of women holding on to children, and the rattle of wagons hitting rough ground all at once and all together. The Santa Fe trains, which had been held just north of the line, began their carefully regulated creep southward, stopping at the main town site points so their passengers could jump out and begin staking. The cavalry, their duty fulfilled, wheeled their horses aside to let the crowd pass. And the crowd passed, and kept passing, and swept across the line into country that, for most of them, they had never seen before in their lives. The first riders out of the northern line turned their horses loose and rode flat out for the most valuable ground. The most valuable ground was not necessarily the richest farmland. It was the ground along the Santa Fe Railroad, and particularly the ground that would become town lots at the stations of Guthrie and Kingfisher and Oklahoma Station, now Oklahoma City. A quarter section of farming land was worth roughly $1,200 at agricultural prices. A quarter section that could be platted into town lots in a future state capital was worth, potentially, many tens of thousands. Every experienced man on the line understood this, and every experienced man on the line rode for the town sites. What they found when they got there was what most of them had feared. A number of the choicest lots were already claimed. Men were already walking the ground, already pounding in stakes, already raising small improvised tents. Some of them claimed they had ridden in at exactly noon, that they had simply been a little faster than the rest, but their horses, in many cases, were grazing quietly by the Cimarron or by one of the creeks. Horses that did not look like horses that had just been ridden flat out for an hour. The stakes were already cut. The tents were already up. The claim papers were already written out in pencil. These men had been inside the unassigned lands for days, maybe weeks. They had hidden in the timber. They had kept their fires small. They had waited for noon from the inside of the line, not the outside. They were Sooners, and their presence on the best lots of the two largest town sites in the new territory would poison the legal record of the land rush for years. Guthrie, by the reckoning of the federal land office that would be established there, became a city in a single afternoon. The Harper's weekly correspondent wrote the line that has been quoted ever since. At 12 o'clock on Monday, he wrote, "The resident population of Guthrie was nothing. Before sundown, it was at least 10,000. In that time, streets had been laid out, town lots staked off, and steps taken toward the formation of a municipal government. 10,000 people in 6 hours, on a piece of ground that morning had no inhabitants, no buildings, no streets, no laws. Some of that 10,000 had ridden in on horseback, charging south from the line. Some had come on the Santa Fe trains, which disgorged hundreds of passengers at Guthrie and at Oklahoma Station in successive runs over the course of the afternoon. Some had been hiding in the brush along the creeks for a week or more. By sundown, tents were pitched on every available flat surface within the unofficial town limits. Claim holders sat in folding chairs on wooden crates, drinking water by the cupful bought from children who had also just arrived. Children who had understood immediately that in a town with 10,000 thirsty adults and no established wells, a bucket of creek water could make a real day's wage at 5 cents a cup. The buffalo dung scattered across the prairie, so useless an hour earlier, was suddenly fuel, and children were gathering it in bundles, selling it to the homesteaders who would be cooking that night. Oklahoma City, called at first Oklahoma Station after the Santa Fe stop, underwent a similar explosion. Within an hour of noon, according to later estimates, 2,500 settlers had claimed town lots on the future state capital. By the following morning, April 23rd, the number was over 12,000. The same pattern played out, though on a smaller scale, at Norman and at El Reno and at Stillwater and at the settlement that was first called Lisbon, but would be renamed Kingfisher by the following day. 6 major town sites had become functional cities in less than 24 hours. Guthrie and Oklahoma City had each, by Harper's Weekly and by the subsequent census, reached a population of roughly 10,000 in the first day. By the end of the first month, Oklahoma City alone had 5 banks and 6 newspapers. It was one of the most extraordinary urban formations in American history, and it happened on land that 48 hours earlier had not even been officially opened. But the town sites were not the whole story. For every one of the 50,000 who rode for a town lot, there were many more who rode for farming land. And the country was enormous. 2 million acres cut by rivers and draws, timbered in places along the creeks, open grassland on the uplands. A man on a fast horse might cover 15 or 20 miles in the first hour. A family with an ox-drawn wagon might cover only a few. The fastest runners scattered across the country along the Santa Fe tracks and the old cattle trails. The slower wagons turned off into the rolling grassland and picked quarter sections where they could find them. The process of establishing a claim was, by law, straightforward. A settler had to drive a stake, literally a wooden stake, into the ground at a recognizable corner of the quarter section, with his or her name and the place of entry written or carved on it. The settler then had to travel to one of the 2 federal land offices, at Guthrie in the north or at Kingfisher in the northwest, to file the claim. To secure full title under the Homestead Act, the settler would then have to live on the land for 5 years and improve it, which meant building a habitation and breaking ground for cultivation. If the settler did not wish to wait 5 years, there was a shorter path available. After 14 months, a settler could simply pay $1.25 per acre, $200 for a full quarter section, and receive title outright. In the first hours after noon, the claim staking was simple in theory and chaotic in practice. Men staked adjacent quarter sections and claimed parts of each other's land. Men staked ground that had already been claimed by a Sooner. Men forgot to mark their stakes legibly. Men, in the heat of the run, failed to ride to the actual corner post of the section they wanted, and instead planted a stake in the middle of the quarter, which would cause endless arguments later over boundaries. Some men, in their haste, staked claims that overlapped by half a mile. Some settled on claims that turned out to be in ravines, or on barren ground, or on the wrong side of a creek that flooded every spring. In the first hour and the first afternoon, the quality of a claim was less important than the fact of staking one at all. The arguments could be worked out later. 1,000 men who had ridden into the unassigned lands in the first hour of the run ended that afternoon with a stake in the ground, a scrap of paper in their pocket, and a quarter section that, in their belief, now belonged to them. By the close of April 22nd, the federal land offices at Guthrie and Kingfisher were already surrounded by lines of claimants waiting to file. Some of those lines would not be fully processed for days. Some of the arguments between claimants would not be settled for months. Some would be appealed all the way to the United States Department of the Interior and would take years to resolve. And many of the disputes, it turned out, would come down to the question of Sooners. The term would come to embed itself so deeply in the culture of the new territory that it would eventually become, within a generation, the official nickname of the state's flagship university. The University of Oklahoma's fight song, Boomer Sooner, takes its name from the two factions of the Oklahoma movement, the legal Boomers who crossed at noon and the illegal Sooners who had crossed early. But on the evening of April 22nd, the Sooners were not yet a nickname. They were a problem. They were the reason that a substantial fraction of the best claims in Guthrie and Oklahoma City and along the Santa Fe line were in the hands of men who, by the plain language of the law, should have been ineligible to hold them. The challenge was how to prove it. A settler who accused another settler of being a Sooner had to produce evidence. Witnesses who could testify that the accused had been inside the unassigned lands before noon, or physical signs of prior occupation, or any other documented fact that could meet the standard of the land office. The legal definition of prior entry turned out to be more slippery than the Boomers had expected. What was entry exactly? Did riding across the line as a deputized mail carrier before noon count? Did working for the Santa Fe Railroad count, since Santa Fe employees had been inside the unassigned lands maintaining track for years? Did a cowboy who had been running cattle on the Ceded Creek and Seminole lands count? The federal land offices, overwhelmed and understaffed, began to develop an informal jurisprudence of Sooner cases almost from the first day. Some cases were obvious, some were not. Some of the most famous claim disputes in Guthrie would be fought over for more than a decade, with appeals winding their way through the Interior Department and eventually the federal courts. For the majority of the honest Boomers, the legal disputes were secondary to the immediate crisis of survival. On the night of April 22nd, 50,000 people were scattered across a country that had, that morning, been empty. There were no established towns, there were no wells, aside from those already dug by the Santa Fe for its rail stations. There was no law, or rather, the only law was the law of the United States, administered at a distance by an Interior Department that was, for the first week, barely present on the ground. There were no churches, there were no schools. There was, for many of the settlers, very little food because they had spent their funds on the journey and were now waiting, under the Homestead Act, for the first crop of their own. The weather held, which was the first mercy. The wind died down overnight. The stars, by the accounts of the settlers who later wrote about that first night, were unusually bright. Fires burned across the 2 million acres of the unassigned lands in a pattern that would have been visible had anyone been in a position to see it, like the lights of an instant nation. Men and women slept on the ground beside the stakes they had driven, afraid, in many cases, to leave the claims unattended for even a few hours. By the second day, the infrastructure of American civil society began, with astonishing speed, to assemble itself on top of the claims. In Guthrie, by the afternoon of April 23rd, streets had been laid out, chalked in some cases, marked with stones in others. A provisional municipal government had been called together. Men who had been strangers 24 hours earlier sat in a makeshift tent and argued about rules for the operation of the new city. The same process unfolded in Oklahoma City. By the first week, makeshift schools had been opened. Children were taught in the early days by volunteer teachers whose fees were paid directly by the parents of the pupils, a system that would continue in some places until regular school districts could be formally established. Within a month, Oklahoma City had 5 banks. 6 newspapers were already publishing. Within weeks, a brass band had been organized and held public concerts on what passed for a town square. The material conditions remained brutal. Lumber was scarce and expensive. Settlers built what they could, sod houses on the open prairie for the farming claims, where the thick prairie grass could be cut into bricks and stacked into walls, dugouts on the creek banks for the even poorer settlers who could not afford lumber or sod-cutting tools, tents that would serve as homes for months in places where no other materials could be found. Water was the problem nobody had fully anticipated. Outside the few points where the Santa Fe had drilled wells, every family had to find a creek or dig its own. The rivers of the country, the Cimarron, the Canadian, the North Canadian, ran brown and silty and carried a risk of disease. Typhoid would appear by the end of the first summer. Dysentery would be a common complaint. The first harvest of homesteaders had to survive not only the physical challenges of the prairie, but the illnesses that came with thousands of people drinking from creeks that had never been expected to support a population like this. And yet they built. They built schools and churches out of unplaned lumber. They built stores out of the ends of abandoned wagons. They built town governments out of what they remembered of town governments back east. They wrote constitutions for their new municipalities in pencil on the backs of train schedules. They organized elections. They organized fire brigades. They organized, in some places, almost immediately, mail delivery. The speed at which American civic life assembled itself in the unassigned lands in the spring and summer of 1889 was a spectacle that even observers from Europe remarked on. A whole society appeared where, 7 days earlier, there had been nothing. Or almost nothing. Because underneath the new sod houses and the new schools and the new town governments, there was still the land. And the land was still the land of the Creek and the Seminole. The compensation had been paid, but the compensation had not been freely accepted. The treaties had been signed, but the treaties had been signed under the pressure of a government that could have taken the land without signing if the signatures had not come. The history beneath the sod was older and longer than the history being written on top of it. And it was a history, at the spring of 1889, still very much alive in the memories of the native nations pressed up against the boundaries of the new, chaotic, ungovernable, unassigned lands. For the moment, though, the noise was all from the settlers. By the end of April, Guthrie was a functioning, if ramshackle, city of more than 10,000. Oklahoma City was not far behind. The federal land offices were processing hundreds of claims a day. The Santa Fe trains were running a continuous stream of new arrivals and new supplies. the first edition of the Guthrie daily newspapers went to press the week of the run itself. The governor-to-be of the new territory, though the formal Oklahoma Territory would not be organized until the passage of the Oklahoma Organic Act, a full year later, on May 2, 1890, was being informally discussed, and the stories that would make the Oklahoma land run one of the most filmed, most photographed, most mythologized episodes in the history of the American West were already being written down, in pencil, in the notebooks of the reporters who had ridden in with the crowd. Not all of the stories were true. Some of them, the tale of Nanita Daisy, a Dallas schoolteacher who was said to have jumped from the cowcatcher of a moving Santa Fe train to stake a claim at Oklahoma Station, a claim later disputed, would be repeated for generations, despite the uncertainty of the historical record. Some of the stories of heroism would turn out, on closer inspection, to be stories of Soonerism. Some of the stories of fairness would turn out to be stories of men who had had a deputy marshal in the family or a friend on the Santa Fe payroll. But the basic facts were unambiguous. The run had happened. The land had been claimed. The country that the morning of April 22nd had been empty was now, on the morning of April 23rd, the home of tens of thousands of people who intended to stay there for the rest of their lives. And by the end of 1889, the census of the unassigned lands, which had been 0 the previous spring, stood at roughly 62,000. A population the size of a small state dropped into the middle of the Indian Territory in the space of a single year. The run had worked. Now the country had to figure out how to live with what the run had done. The summer of 1889 would tell the honest story of what had happened on April 22nd. The run had been a spectacle. What came after was the work. For every man who had staked a quarter section of rich farming ground, there were 3 or 4 more who had staked ground that would not support a crop. Parts of the unassigned lands were excellent: dark loam, rolling grassland, timber on the creeks. Other parts were thin, stony, or too dry for the kind of crops the settlers had brought their seeds to plant. Men who had ridden hard in the heat of the first hour had sometimes staked claims they could not possibly farm, and the Homestead Act was unforgiving on this point. The law required the settler to live on the claim for 5 years and to improve it. Abandoning a claim for more than 6 months at a stretch forfeited it. A man who could not support his family on his 160 acres had 2 choices. He could stay and starve and hope, or he could walk away and try to find some other line of work and lose the claim. Many walked away. The Homestead Act, in its full 19th and 20th century operation, would see about 40% of all claimants successfully prove up and receive title. The other 60%, nationwide, either abandoned their claims or failed to meet the requirements. There is no reason to think the success rate in the unassigned lands was any higher. Tens of thousands of the 50,000 who ran on April 22nd would, over the next 5 years, quietly give up the ground they had fought for and leave. The winners, however, were not always the men who had run fastest. Some of the winners were men who had barely run at all. Some of the winners were Sooners. The legal history of Soonerism is one of the most tangled chapters in American land law. It began in the spring and summer of 1889 with accusations and counter-accusations in the Guthrie and Kingfisher land offices. A man named Smith would file a claim on a quarter section. A man named Jones would arrive behind him and file a contest, alleging that Smith had been on the land before noon. Smith would deny it. Jones would produce witnesses, cousins of Jones, usually, or men who had ridden in with him. Smith would produce his own witnesses. The federal land officer would take sworn statements. In many cases, the officer would be unable to determine the truth and would send the contest up the chain to the regional office in Washington, and from there, eventually, to the Interior Department itself. The most famous Sooner cases dragged on for the better part of the 1890s. One contested claim in Guthrie for a town lot that was worth, by 1890, several $1,000s, was litigated for more than 6 years. A number of claims in the most valuable positions on the main streets of Guthrie, on what was to become the Capitol Square along the Santa Fe right-of-way in downtown Oklahoma City, would eventually be voided by the Interior Department on findings that the claimant had been a Sooner. Others, equally suspicious, were upheld for lack of proof. The burden of proof in these cases was on the contestant. A Sooner who could keep his mouth shut, keep his witnesses in line, and ride out the initial fury of the legal disputes had a reasonable chance of holding his claim. This, in the end, is how the pejorative became a badge of honor, and how the University of Oklahoma would eventually feel comfortable naming itself, at least informally, after the cheaters. But not everyone who staked a claim in the unassigned lands was a white man. The black communities that had organized around W.L. Eagleson's Oklahoma Immigration Organization and around Edward Preston McCabe were on the line, too. They did not come in the numbers that the leaders had hoped. The plan to make Oklahoma a black state died quickly, in part because Harrison had not appointed McCabe as the territorial governor, in part because the overwhelming white majority on the border made the demographic math impossible. But thousands of black families did run, and several of the towns they founded, Langston, Boley, Redbird, and most importantly the community that would grow up around Kingfisher, became some of the most significant black settlements in the West. Langston, Oklahoma, named for the Virginia Congressman John Mercer Langston, would become a center of black education and eventually the home of a historically black college. These towns were not what the most ambitious leaders had hoped for. They were not a black state, but they were, within the limits of what had been possible in 1889, real. They were places where African-American families could own land in their own names, send their children to schools of their own founding, and, for at least a generation, raise their heads in a way that had been impossible in the post-Reconstruction South. There were also women. The folklore of the land run has tended to remember the riders as male, the lone horseman or the bachelor farmer. The reality was that single women made up a significant minority of the homesteaders in Oklahoma as across the broader Homestead Act. Widows filed claims. Divorced women filed claims. Unmarried adult women who had declared themselves heads of household filed claims. The most famous of the women claimants of April 22nd was Nanita Daisy, a Dallas schoolteacher whose contemporary press accounts described her as having leaped from the cowcatcher of a Santa Fe engine to plant a flag at Oklahoma Station. A story whose details are disputed by historians, but whose essential fact, that she was the first or among the first women to file a claim in Oklahoma City, appears to be supported by the land office records. For every Nanita Daisy, there were dozens of quieter women who rode in a wagon alongside no husband and filed their own claim in their own name. Women whose stories never made the Harper's weekly dispatches, but whose names appear on the homestead rolls at the Guthrie and Kingfisher land offices for anyone who cares to look. What they all shared, the honest boomers and the Sooners, the black families and the single women, the European immigrants and the Civil War veterans, was the first summer of 1889, and the first summer was hard. The crops they planted were largely wrong for the country. Men from Indiana and Illinois planted corn on ground that wanted wheat. Men from Kansas planted wheat on ground that would have been better used for sorghum. The rains were adequate that first year, which was a mercy, But the heat of July and August on the open prairie was unlike anything the settlers from the east had experienced. The sod-busting plows that had worked well in Kansas struggled in patches where the thick prairie grass had roots 10 feet deep. Some of the homesteaders in the first summer managed to break only an acre or two of their 160. It was the beginning of years of work. The land would reward patience. But many of the settlers who had come to Oklahoma expecting the fairy tale homestead of the immigrant newspapers, lush soil, easy crops, quick wealth, began, by July and August of 1889, to understand that the work was going to be much harder than they had been told. And over all of it, the territorial question hung unresolved. There was no Oklahoma Territory yet. The 2 million acres that had been opened were, technically, still part of the Indian Territory, now filled with a white and black population of some 62,000, but without any formal government. The Oklahoma Organic Act, which would finally create the Oklahoma Territory as a distinct administrative unit, would not be passed by Congress until May 2nd, 1890. For a full year after the run, the new settlers would live in a kind of legal twilight, governed by improvised municipal authorities and by the distant, understaffed Interior Department. It was a recipe for chaos, and there was plenty of chaos. Claim jumping continued through the summer. Criminal gangs emerged in Guthrie and Oklahoma City, taking advantage of the weak law enforcement. Vigilance committees formed in response. The historian Glenn Shirley would later write an entire book, West of Hell's Fringe, documenting the waves of crime and countercrime that swept through the new country in the year after the run. It was, in every sense, the frontier. But the country held. The sod houses stood, the schools opened, the newspapers kept printing, and by the first anniversary of the run, on April 22, 1890, Guthrie was functioning as the territorial capital, and the Oklahoma Organic Act was about to be signed. The first run had proven the concept. The federal government had demonstrated to its own satisfaction that it could open a large tract of Indian territory, settle it in a matter of hours, and absorb the population into the American political system. It had also demonstrated the opposite, that the rush was chaotic, that it rewarded cheaters, that it punished the slow and the underprepared. The lessons would be debated in Congress for years, and they would be debated with urgency, because the 1889 run was not going to be the last. Within 2 years, another opening would take place of lands ceded by the Iowa, Sac and Fox, Potawatomi and Shawnee nations. Within 4 years, the greatest single land run of all, the opening of the Cherokee Outlet or Cherokee Strip, would dwarf the original unassigned lands rush in scale. More than 6 million additional acres and more than 100,000 participants would cross the line on September 16, 1893. Each opening would follow the same basic script. Each would produce its own Sooners, its own legal contests, its own instant cities, and its own harvest of dispossessed native nations. The run of 1889 had been the first. It would not be the last. And the frontier that Americans had always assumed would continue to open westward forever was, it turned out, nearly exhausted, because the old frontier was dying. The Sioux had been defeated at Wounded Knee only 18 months after the Oklahoma run. The buffalo were almost gone. The open range was being fenced behind barbed wire. The superintendent of the United States Census, Robert P. Porter, would write in his 1890 report the sentence that historian Frederick Jackson Turner would make famous: "The frontier, as a continuous line of settlement with unsettled land beyond it, could no longer be said to exist." The Oklahoma Land Run of 1889 had helped kill it. The Oklahoma Organic Act, signed into law by President Harrison on May 2, 1890, did 3 things. It created, for the first time, a formal Oklahoma Territory as a distinct unit of the United States, separate from the Indian Territory that still surrounded it. It added the Panhandle, the strip of land to the west that had, since the earliest days of American Texas, existed in a kind of administrative no-man's land, to the new territory. And it named Guthrie as the territorial capital, a designation Guthrie would hold for the remainder of the territorial period and into early statehood. For the settlers of the unassigned lands, the Organic Act was the moment the legal fiction finally caught up with the demographic fact. They had been in the country for a full year. They had built their towns. They had organized their schools and their churches and their first banks. They had filed their claims and contested their claims, and in many cases lost their claims. Now they had at last a government of their own. Elections were scheduled. A territorial legislature was established. Oklahoma had become, in every sense except the final constitutional one, a state. But the Oklahoma Territory was still only half of what the map would one day show. The other half remained the Indian Territory of the 5 tribes and the many smaller nations now living among them. And the political logic of the moment was plain. Sooner or later, the Oklahoma Territory and the Indian Territory would be merged. Sooner or later, Oklahoma would become a state, and the path to that outcome ran directly through the destruction of tribal sovereignty over the lands that had, since the 1830s, been held in common. The instrument of that destruction was a law that had already been passed, but whose implementation against the 5 tribes had been delayed. It was called the Dawes Act, or more formally, the General Allotment Act, signed in 1887 by Grover Cleveland. The Dawes Act proposed to take the communal lands of the Indian nations and break them up into individual parcels, which would be allotted to tribal members, typically 160 acres to each head of household. Any lands left over after allotment would be declared surplus and made available for sale to non-native settlers. It was, in effect, the same logic that had driven the opening of the unassigned lands, applied now to the whole of the Indian Territory. When the Dawes Act passed in 1887, the 5 civilized tribes had been specifically exempted. The Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Muscogee Creek, and Seminole were to keep their communal lands until the year 1902. But the success of the Oklahoma Land Run of 1889 changed the political calculation. If 2 million acres of the old Creek and Seminole cession could be settled and absorbed into the American political system in a matter of months, what justification remained for leaving the rest of the Indian Territory in tribal hands? Within 2 years of the run, Congress was acting again. In 1891, lands that had belonged to the Iowa, Sac and Fox, Pottawatomie and Shawnee were opened to homesteading in a second, smaller land run. In 1892, additional lands were opened from the Cheyenne and Arapaho Reservation. And on September 16, 1893, the largest single land run in American history opened the Cherokee Outlet, also called the Cherokee Strip, a tract of more than 6 million acres running along the southern border of Kansas. Estimates of the participants that day ranged as high as 100,000. Town sites like Enid, Perry, and Alva appeared in a single afternoon, following the same chaotic pattern that Guthrie and Oklahoma City had established 4 years earlier. The Cherokee Nation had not willingly sold the outlet. The sale had been negotiated under heavy federal pressure. The United States had refused to pay for grazing leases, threatened to abandon the Cherokee entirely, and maneuvered the tribal leadership into a position where acceptance of a lowball compensation was the only alternative to outright confiscation. The bitterness of the sale would outlive the Cherokee leaders who had signed it, and the land run that followed, filmed 30 years later in Hollywood adaptations of Edna Ferber's Cimarron, would enter American popular culture as an image of Western adventure, with the tribal dispossession that made it possible almost entirely erased from the narrative. Each successive opening followed the same script. Each produced its own Sooners. Each created its own instant towns. Each extracted another few million acres from the tribal land base. By the turn of the century, what had begun in 1889 as a 2-million-acre opening had expanded into a systematic dismantling of the Indian Territory. The Dawes Commission, formed by Congress in 1893 specifically to force allotment on the 5 tribes, began the long, slow process of converting communal holdings into individual parcels. The exemption that had been promised until 1902 was effectively stripped away earlier by negotiation and pressure. The Curtis Act of 1898 abolished tribal courts and extended federal law over the 5 tribes. By 1907, when Oklahoma was admitted to the Union as the 46th state, the Indian Territory had ceased to exist as a meaningful entity. It was absorbed, with the Oklahoma Territory, into the new state. The tribal governments that had survived removal and the Civil War and the Reconstruction-era treaties were, for all practical purposes, dissolved. The 5 tribes did not go away. They remain today some of the largest and most powerful native nations in the United States. The Cherokee Nation, headquartered in Tahlequah, has more than 700,000 enrolled members. The Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Muskogee Creek, and the Seminole each maintain their own governments, their own courts, and their own treaty rights. In the 21st century, the Supreme Court ruled, in the case known as McGirt versus Oklahoma, that a substantial portion of the old Indian Territory remains, under federal law, a Muskogee Creek Reservation, a decision whose implications are still being worked out. But the land base that the tribes control today is a tiny fraction of what the 1830s treaties had promised them and what the Dawes Act stripped away. The men who had made the 1889 run possible did not all live to see what it became. William Couch, who had taken up the Boomer movement after David Payne's poisoning, was elected the first mayor of Oklahoma City in the chaotic first months after the run. His tenure was short. Within a year of the run, he was shot in a claim dispute, the kind of dispute that had become routine in the unsettled legal environment of the unassigned lands. The wound became infected. He died in April of 1890, almost exactly a year after the run he had done so much to make possible. He was 40 years old. William McKendree Springer, the Illinois congressman whose amendment had opened the unassigned lands, served in Congress until 1895, when he lost re-election in the fight between gold Democrats and silver Democrats that split his party during the 1890s. President Grover Cleveland, returning to office for a second term, appointed Springer as a judge for the Northern District of the United States Court for the Indian Territory, a bench that had been created partly through Springer's own legislative work. He served there until 1899. In his later years, he represented the Muskogee Nation and the Cherokee Nation as a private attorney, a striking reversal, considering that his amendment had helped open the first chapter of the dispossession those nations had suffered. In 1901, he took up the case of Lone Wolf, a Kiowa leader fighting the forced cession of the Kiowa Comanche Apache Reservation. Springer argued, eventually before the United States Supreme Court, that Congress could not unilaterally abrogate the provisions of an Indian treaty. The Supreme Court, in a unanimous decision in January of 1903, rejected his argument. The case, Lone Wolf versus Hitchcock, established the doctrine that Congress had plenary power over native tribes and could overwrite treaty provisions at will. It is still considered one of the worst decisions in the history of Indian law. William McKendry Springer died of pneumonia 11 months after the ruling, in December of 1903, at the age of 67. Edward Preston McCabe, the black leader who had hoped to be appointed territorial governor, did not abandon the dream of a black majority territory. In the years after the run, he worked to promote black settlement in Oklahoma, particularly in the town of Langston, which he helped found in 1890. He was instrumental in the establishment of the Colored Agricultural and Normal University at Langston in 1897, the institution that would become Langston University, the only historically black college and university in Oklahoma. As white supremacist politics tightened their grip on the new state in the early 20th century, McCabe eventually moved to Chicago, where he died in 1920. Nanita Daisy, the Dallas schoolteacher who had ridden a Santa Fe engine to Oklahoma Station, married and moved to the town of El Reno, where she worked for years as a newspaper woman. Her own account of the run, written years later, became one of the key primary sources historians still consult when they try to separate the legend of the land rush from the fact. The exact details of her famous leap from the cowcatcher have never been fully verified, but the claim she filed in Oklahoma City is real, and her name is in the land office records, and the quarter section she staked became part of the growing capital. Tens of thousands of other settlers, whose names did not make the newspapers, went on to live the ordinary lives of homesteaders. Some proved up on their claims, some did not. Some built prosperous farms, some sold out and moved on. Their descendants, in the hundreds of thousands, are Oklahomans today. The United States National Park Service has estimated that nationwide, some 93 million living Americans descend from people who received land under the Homestead Acts. A significant fraction of those descendants trace their ancestry to the various Oklahoma land runs of the 1880s and 90s. What survives, physically, of the 1889 run? More than a person might expect, and less than a person might hope. Guthrie, the original territorial capital, lost that designation when Oklahoma became a state in 1907. In a move that came to be known as the Midnight Seal, a bit of political theater involving the state seal, Oklahoma City secured the capital for itself, and Guthrie, which had been the first American city of the unassigned lands, began a long economic decline. Today, Guthrie is a much smaller town than it was in its first summer, but it has preserved remarkably well its late 19th century architecture. Its downtown is one of the largest historic districts on the National Register in the United States. Walking through Guthrie today is, in some measurable sense, walking through the physical residue of April 22nd, 1889. The same streets that were chalked into existence in the first hours of the run are still there, still laid out along the same lines. The land office where the claims were filed still stands. Some of the earliest wooden buildings, patched and repatched, are still standing 137 years after they were raised. Oklahoma City, which at first was only Oklahoma Station, a Santa Fe stop, grew in almost exactly the opposite direction. It became the state capital. It became a major American city. It became a center of the oil industry that would transform Oklahoma's economy in the 20th century. The quarter sections that had been staked in the frantic first hours of the run were eventually platted into the grid of a modern metropolis. A person standing today in downtown Oklahoma City is standing, in most cases, on ground that was staked by a Sooner on April 22, 1889, or staked by someone who thought he had beaten a Sooner and spent the next decade trying to prove it. The University of Oklahoma, founded in Norman in 1890, took as its informal identity the language of the run itself. Its fight song, Boomer Sooner, written in 1905, is still sung at every home football game. Its mascot, a painted wagon called the Sooner Schooner, is pulled across the football field by two ponies, one named Boomer and the other named Sooner. The cheaters and the legal claimants are, in the iconography of the state's flagship university, indistinguishable. Generations of Oklahomans have taken pride in this. Generations of observers have found it, at minimum, peculiar. That a state has embraced as its central public symbol the name of the men who broke the law to claim its land is a fact worth thinking about. There are other memorials. A monument to the run stands in Guthrie. Another stands in Oklahoma City, paintings of the rush, the romantic, crowd-heavy horse and wagon canvases that have become the dominant visual image of the run. Hang in the Oklahoma State Capitol, in museums, in old saloons that have been converted into tourist stops. The photographs from the original run, some of them taken by William S. Prettyman and other frontier photographers who had ridden in with the crowd, are reproduced endlessly. The single most famous image, a crowd of men on horseback, mid-stride, raising dust across an open prairie, has been used to illustrate the run in thousands of history books and schoolroom lessons. It is a real photograph. It really was taken that day, but it shows only a fraction of what happened, and it shows nothing at all of what was there before. Because the uncomfortable truth of the 1889 run is this: the country that was settled that day had already been settled many times over before the first American homesteader ever saw it. The prairies of the unassigned lands had been the hunting grounds of Plains nations for generations before the Creek and Seminole were removed to them in the 1830s. The Wichita had villages along the Canadian. The Caddo had traveled the country between the Cimarron and the Red. The Osage had hunted the same prairies. The Creek and Seminole, after their forced removal, had built towns and churches and farms of their own in the territory before the Civil War, and their settlements extended into the lands that would later be declared unassigned. The ground that was staked on April 22nd had been walked, cultivated, hunted, and lived upon for longer than the United States itself had existed. To call it empty, as the Homestead Act and the Indian Appropriations Act and the Boomer newspapers had consistently called it, was to commit an act of deliberate forgetting. The descendants of the native nations whose land was opened that day are still there. The Muskogee Creek Nation, whose original cession had made the unassigned lands available, operates today out of Okmulgee, a short drive from the land that was opened in the run. The Seminole Nation of Oklahoma operates out of Wewoka. Their governments have survived the Dawes Act, the Curtis Act, the Oklahoma Organic Act, the Allotment Commissions, and the long 20th century of federal policy experiments. They have courts, they have schools, they have clinics, they have casinos whose revenues fund the functions that the federal government promised, by treaty, to provide. And they remember, with the precision that only the dispossessed can summon, what was taken from them. This is the harder layer of the land-run story. It is not the layer the dime novels told. It is not the layer that Hollywood told in Cimarron in 1931 and again in 1960, or in Far and Away in 1992. It is not the layer that appears on the state seal, or in the University of Oklahoma fight song, or in the annual 89ers Day celebrations that are still held in Oklahoma towns that trace their founding to the run. But it is the layer that is true, and a documentary series that calls itself an archive that takes seriously the idea that history is not only what the victors wrote down, has to tell it. What does the 1889 run mean, then, for Americans who look back at it now? It is not a simple question. It was, on one hand, a genuine democratic event. 50,000 people of wildly different backgrounds, native-born Americans, immigrants, black and white, single women and married couples, Union veterans and former Confederates, had the same opportunity to claim land under the same law. The Homestead Act was in its way one of the most radically egalitarian land policies any nation has ever attempted. For the families who proved up on their claims, and for their descendants, the run was the beginning of ownership, of stability, of an inheritance that could be passed down. There are 93 million living Americans who trace their property, their towns, their family stories to the Homestead Acts. This is not nothing. It was, on the other hand, the systematic dispossession of another people. The 2 million acres opened on April 22nd had been ceded by the Creek and Seminole under duress. The many millions of acres opened in the runs that followed had been taken from nations whose consent had been manufactured by a federal government with overwhelming power. The Dawes Act and the Curtis Act and the allotment commissions completed the dismantling of the tribal land base. The Lone Wolf decision, argued unsuccessfully by William Springer himself in his last public case, sealed the legal principle that Congress could overwrite treaty rights without consent. This also is not nothing. Both of these facts are true. The land run created the ownership structure of a state. It also erased, in law and on paper, the older structure that had been there before. Any account of April 22, 1889, that presents one side without the other is telling a partial story. The whole story is harder, and it is stranger, and it is more American. At the end of the day of the run, the sun went down over the unassigned lands in the usual way. The cook fires of the settlers burned across the country. The horses grazed where they had been tied. The railroad trains sat silent on the tracks. The land offices at Guthrie and Kingfisher locked their doors for the night, to reopen at dawn with the lines already longer. It had been, by any measure, one of the most extraordinary days in the history of the American West. And it was the beginning, not the end, of what the land run would do. To understand what the 1889 run set in motion, it helps to follow the land runs that came after it, one at a time. The second major opening came in September of 1891. The land involved was smaller, about 868,000 acres, comprising the reservations of the Iowa, the Sac and Fox, the Potawatomi, and the Shawnee nations. These were the same peoples who had been gradually relocated into the Indian Territory from the upper Midwest over the course of the middle 19th century. Their reservations, under pressure from the Dawes allotment process, had been reduced to fragments. What the federal government declared as surplus was then opened to white settlement on the pattern of 1889. The run took place on September 22, 1891. An estimated 20,000 people participated, smaller than the original rush, but large enough to repeat all of the same dynamics. Sooners hid in the timber. Town sites appeared in a single afternoon. Claim contests piled up in the land offices. A few months later, in April of 1892, came the opening of the Cheyenne and Arapaho country, a vast tract of more than 3.5 million acres west of the original unassigned lands. The Cheyenne and Arapaho had been relocated to Oklahoma after the Plains Wars of the 1860s and 70s. Their lands had been allotted under a version of the Dawes process that applied to them directly, and the surplus was opened on April 19, 1892. The run drew tens of thousands more homesteaders. It produced the towns of Watonga, El Reno, and Cheyenne. It followed every pattern already established. And then, on September 16, 1893, came the greatest of them all, the Cherokee Outlet Run. The Cherokee Outlet, sometimes called the Cherokee Strip, was a horizontal band of more than 6 million acres running along the southern border of Kansas. It had been granted to the Cherokee Nation as part of their forced relocation in the 1830s. The Cherokee had not lived on it in large numbers. They had used it primarily as hunting ground and had leased it to cattlemen for grazing. When the federal government began pressuring the Cherokee to sell, it was the leases that gave Washington its leverage. The United States simply refused to continue collecting grazing fees on behalf of the tribe, and the Cherokee, facing a collapse of their tribal revenues, had little choice. A compensation of $8.5 million was negotiated, far below the value of the land, and the outlet was declared open. The run that followed set records that have never been broken. More than 100,000 people lined up along the border, by far the largest crowd of any of the Oklahoma land runs. 6 million acres opened at a single stroke. The heat was brutal that September, estimated at over 100 degrees in the shade when the noon signal came. Water wagons that had been pre-positioned along the route ran out within hours. At least a dozen participants died of heat stroke or thirst on the first day. Horses collapsed. The race disintegrated almost immediately into a chaos that made the 1889 run look tidy by comparison. But by the end of the day, towns like Enid and Perry and Alva had been founded, the outlet had been distributed, and the Cherokee Nation had lost its largest remaining land holding. The outlet run is, in many ways, the one Americans actually remember when they think of the Oklahoma land rush. The iconic photographs, the crowds on horseback, the dust, the wagons, are very often from 1893, not from 1889. The Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman film Far and Away, released in 1992, dramatizes the Cherokee Outlet Run, not the first one. And the University of Oklahoma's fight song, though it takes the names Boomer and Sooner from the movement that preceded 1889, celebrates a mythology that blends all of the land runs into a single heroic moment. Smaller runs continued through the 1890s. The Kickapoo lands were opened in 1895. The Wichita and Caddo lands were opened by lottery in 1901, by which point the federal government had quietly given up on the land run model, having concluded, after a decade of Soonerism and claim disputes and violent contests, that a lottery system produced fewer legal problems. The last of the openings, in 1906, came on the eve of Oklahoma statehood. By the time Oklahoma was admitted as the 46th state on November 16, 1907, almost every acre of what had been Indian territory 40 years earlier was in white or black American hands, or in privately allotted tribal ownership. The communal land base of the 5 tribes had been effectively destroyed. The Dawes Commission, which had been established by Congress in 1893 specifically to extend allotment to the 5 civilized tribes, had done its work. Under the Curtis Act of 1898, a law that extended federal authority over the Indian Territory and stripped away the jurisdiction of the tribal courts, the 5 tribes had been compelled to accept allotment despite their original exemption from the Dawes Act. The tribal rolls, known as the Dawes Rolls, were drawn up. Each enrolled member of each tribe received an individual allotment of land. The lands left over were sold or opened to settlement. The tribal governments were instructed by federal law that they would cease to function at Oklahoma statehood. This last provision, in practice, was never fully carried out. The tribal governments did not dissolve. They shrank. They were hamstrung. They lost jurisdiction over most of their traditional territory, but they did not disappear. And in the 20th century, particularly after the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934 and the self-determination era beginning in the 1960s, the 5 tribes began a slow reconstruction of their sovereignty. By the 21st century, the Cherokee Nation operates its own justice system, its own hospitals, its own schools, and its own gaming enterprises. The Muskogee Creek Nation, the Chickasaw Nation, the Choctaw Nation, and the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma likewise maintain governments that, in many important respects, function as true sovereign nations within the federal system. The 1989 run did not destroy them. The full historical arc of the Indian Territory did not, in the end, erase them. But the arc did reshape the territory beyond recognition. The human cost of the later runs deserves its own accounting. The Cherokee Outlet Run of 1893 was the deadliest. The heat that September was extreme, estimated at over 100 degrees in the shade when the signal came, and the crowd was more than twice the size of 1889's. The distances riders had to cover to reach the desirable land were longer, and the pre-positioned water wagons, which Army planners had thought would be sufficient, ran dry within the first hours. Several riders died of heat stroke or thirst on the first afternoon. Horses collapsed in the first hour and were left where they fell along the trails north of the Cimarron. Contemporary newspaper reports described men staggering on foot toward the next water source after their mounts had given out, some reaching it and some not. The exact death toll of the outlet run has never been fully calculated. The newspapers of the day ran the heroic photographs and the town-founding narratives and the names of the men who had staked the richest lots. The deaths along the trail, the collapsed horses, the families who did not survive the run or the first summer that followed, all of this was quietly absorbed into the statistical margin of Western settlement. It was treated, in the phrasing of the day, as the cost of progress. In the longer view of history, it was simply the cost. The black towns that had been founded in the first wave of the land runs, Langston, Bowley, Redbird, and many smaller settlements, had their own complicated afterlives. Langston, founded by Edward Preston McCabe in 1890, grew into a small but influential black community. The Colored Agricultural and Normal University, founded in 1897, became Langston University and remains the only historically black college in Oklahoma today. Bowley, founded a decade later, became, by the early 20th century, one of the largest and wealthiest all-black towns in the United States. At its peak, Bowley had its own bank, its own newspapers, its own cotton gin, its own hotels, and its own thriving business district. Then came Oklahoma statehood and the white supremacist politics that came with it. In 1907, the first act of the new state legislature was a law segregating railroad cars. Grandfather clauses disenfranchised black voters. The Ku Klux Klan grew explosively in Oklahoma in the 1910s and 1920s. And in 1921, the Tulsa Race Massacre destroyed the Greenwood District, Black Wall Street, in one of the worst episodes of racial violence in American history. The black towns of Oklahoma survived, but in drastically diminished form. Most lost their economic base as the oil boom bypassed them and as Jim Crow laws strangled their businesses. Langston and Bowley still exist today, though they are shadows of what they were in the first decades after the land runs. The dream of a black state in Oklahoma, the dream of W.L. Eagleson and Edward Preston McCabe, died slowly over the course of the early 20th century. It did not die because the black settlers failed. It died because the legal and political structure of the state was rebuilt around them in ways that made the dream impossible. The single women homesteaders of the unassigned lands had a different kind of afterlife. Most of them, the widows and the divorcees and the unmarried teachers and shopkeepers, eventually married and their claims were folded into their husbands' holdings, which was a common pattern across the Homestead Act. Some remained single, some proved up on their claims in their own names and kept them. Their stories rarely entered the popular mythology of the land run. The iconic images of the rush are of horsemen, not horsewomen, and the dime novels that shaped the popular memory were not written with single women in mind. But the land office records tell a different story, and a researcher today can still find, in the archives at the Oklahoma Historical Society and at the National Archives, thousands of homestead patents issued to single women who staked claims on April 22, 1889. The European immigrants who ran that day became Oklahomans. Germans settled in concentrated pockets around Kingfisher. Irish settlers, many of them veterans of construction work on the transcontinental railroads, settled along the Santa Fe line. Scandinavians, though less numerous in Oklahoma than in the Dakotas, claimed quarter sections in the northern counties. The children and grandchildren of those immigrants fought in both world wars, farmed through the Dust Bowl, and suffered through the collapse of the rural economy in the 1920s and 30s. The Dust Bowl, in particular, was catastrophic for Oklahoma agriculture. The prairie soils that had been broken by sod-busting plows on April 22, 1889, and in the decades that followed, dried out and blew away during the droughts of the 1930s. The migration that John Steinbeck made famous in The Grapes of Wrath was, in substantial part, a migration of people whose grandparents had ridden in the land runs. They had come to Oklahoma for free land. Their descendants left because the land would no longer support them. And yet, for all of that, for all of the loss, the dispossession, the racial violence, the ecological disaster, the land runs created the foundation of the state that exists today. Oklahoma's modern counties are almost exactly the counties that were laid out in the first year after the 1889 run. The towns that emerged on that first afternoon are, in many cases, still the major settlements of central Oklahoma: Guthrie, Oklahoma City, Kingfisher, Norman, El Reno, Stillwater. Each of them came into being on a single day in the spring of 1889, and each of them has grown or shrunk or adapted over the century and a third that has followed, but none of them has fundamentally moved. The physical geography of the state, its road grid, its railroad lines, its county seats, its state capital, is the direct legacy of what happened on April 22nd. The Oklahoma Historical Society maintains today extensive archives on the run. The Gateway to Oklahoma History Project has digitized much of the documentary record. Photographs from the original run, including the famous images by William S. Prettyman and other photographers, are available online to anyone. The land office records at the National Archives in Fort Worth preserve the original claim filings with names and dates and legal descriptions of each quarter section. A person whose family tradition holds that an ancestor rode on April 22, 1889, can verify the claim in an afternoon of research. Many family traditions, when verified, turn out to be accurate. Some turn out to be the comfortable rewriting of family memory, covering for a relative who came later, or who came as a Sooner, or who never ran at all. Every year, in several Oklahoma towns, the anniversary of the run is commemorated. Guthrie holds an annual 89er Days celebration with parades, reenactments, and street festivals. Similar events occur in Oklahoma City, in Norman, and in smaller towns across the central part of the state. The celebrations are, by and large, uncritical of the underlying history. They remember the ride. They celebrate the founders. They do not typically acknowledge the Creek and the Seminole whose ceded land was the prize. They do not typically discuss the black communities that were built and then systematically broken by the state government that emerged from the run. They do not typically mention the Sooners in any critical sense, the cheaters, that is, who in a state that took its official nickname from them have become folk heroes rather than villains. This is the condition of memory in a country that was built on contested ground. The story that is easiest to tell is the story that leaves out the cost. The story that is hardest to tell is the one that includes it. One of the most remarkable developments in recent years has been the renewed assertion of tribal sovereignty over lands that, since the 1889 run, were considered settled. In July of 2020, the United States Supreme Court ruled in McGirt versus Oklahoma that approximately half of the state of Oklahoma, including most of Tulsa, remained, under federal law, the Muscogee Creek Reservation. The decision hinged on the question of whether Congress had ever formally disestablished the reservation. The court held that it had not. Similar rulings have since extended the logic to the other 5 tribes. Today, much of eastern Oklahoma is considered Indian country under federal law, which means that major crimes committed on that land by or against Native Americans fall under tribal or federal, not state, jurisdiction. The political and legal implications are still being worked out, but the ruling has done something that seemed impossible in the century and a quarter after the land runs. It has placed the old treaty rights back into the center of Oklahoma law. The ground that was supposedly settled in the runs of the 1880s and 90s has turned out to be, in an important legal sense, never fully settled at all. None of this undoes the dispossession. The allotment process stripped the 5 tribes of the vast majority of their communal land. Individual Native families lost land to swindlers, to fraudulent guardianship arrangements, and to the oil companies that flooded Oklahoma after the turn of the century. No court ruling in the 21st century can restore what was taken, but the McGirt decision has reminded Americans, and in particular Oklahomans, that the treaties were not voided. They were violated. And in the long arc of the law, violation and voiding are not the same thing. This is the legacy that the writers of April 22, 1889 left behind, whether they knew it or not. They rode into a country whose ownership was, at the deepest level, still under negotiation. They built towns and farms and schools and governments on top of that unresolved question. They passed the question down to their children and grandchildren, and the question is still being answered in the courts and in the state legislatures and in the long, quiet negotiations between the tribal governments and the state of Oklahoma more than 130 years later. The run was not the end of the story. It was, as all such beginnings are, only the first mile of a much longer road. On the evening of April 22, 1889, a man named Harry Hill Bandholtz, a young Army lieutenant who had been detailed to keep order at Guthrie, sat down to write a letter. He had been on his feet since dawn. He had watched the run from the platform of the Santa Fe station. He had seen the crowd hit the town site like a wave. And he had spent the afternoon, by his own account, simply trying to prevent men from killing each other over disputed lots. What he wrote, in the letter home, was not the triumphant language of the newspapers. It was quieter than that. He wrote that he had seen in a single afternoon a city come into being out of nothing, and that he did not yet know what to make of it. He wrote that the country was going to need a long time to settle itself. He was right. The country did need a long time. And in some ways, it is still settling. Edward Preston McCabe died in Chicago in the winter of 1920, far from the Oklahoma he had tried to remake. The black state he had envisioned never came to be. But Langston University, the institution he helped found, still stands, and still educates, and still carries forward a piece of the vision that brought him to the border of the unassigned lands in the spring of 1889. William Couch was buried in Oklahoma City in the spring of 1890, a little over a year after the run that he, more than any other man, had made politically possible. He was 40 years old. He had been the first mayor of the city he had helped call into existence. His grave is in Fairlawn Cemetery. A stone marker notes his role in the Boomer movement. Few tourists visit. David Payne was buried in Wellington, Kansas in 1884, 5 years before the run he did not live to see. The rumor that he had been poisoned by cattlemen was never proved, and it was never disproved. A memorial to him stands today in the town square of Stillwater, Oklahoma, a town he never set foot in, on land he never successfully claimed. William McKendry Springer was buried in Oak Ridge Cemetery in Springfield, Illinois, in the winter of 1903. His grave is only a short walk from Abraham Lincoln's tomb. His amendment opened the unassigned lands. His final case, argued before the Supreme Court as an advocate for Kiowa, Comanche, and Apache leaders, failed to stop the dispossession his own earlier work had helped begin. The two halves of his public life do not resolve into a single clean story. They stand side by side, as contradictory as the country he served. The Creek Nation and the Seminole Nation, whose ceded lands were the ground of the original run, did not vanish. They rebuilt after the allotment era. They rebuilt after Oklahoma statehood. They rebuilt after the Dust Bowl and the Depression and the federal termination policies of the 1950s. Today, their governments operate, their courts hear cases, their children attend schools in which their languages are taught. The Treaty of 1866 that forced them to cede the unassigned lands is a document their tribal historians still teach. The compensation that was paid, the 81 cents per acre, is a figure their lawyers still cite. They did not consent to the run. They were not asked whether April 22, 1889, should become a day of American celebration. They were asked only to sign and to accept and to watch from across a line. What survives of the run today at the level of physical landscape is most of a state. The roads follow the section lines that were surveyed for the claims. The towns sit where the claims of the first day clustered around the Santa Fe stations. The counties are shaped by the administrative divisions of the Oklahoma Territory as it was organized under the Organic Act of 1890. The grid of central Oklahoma is, in a real sense, the grid of a single day. And at the level of memory, what survives is a set of images. A man leaning forward in the saddle, a crowd of wagons raising dust across the prairie, a woman clutching a flag, a young boy holding the reins of a horse that is larger than he is, a tent at sunset, a stake driven into the earth. These images are real. They were photographed. They have been reproduced so many times that it is almost impossible now to see past them, to see the country that was there before the riders came, to see the women and children and elders of the Creek and the Seminole and the Plains nations who were watching from the boundaries of their own lands as the horsemen raised the dust. It is possible to tell the story of the Oklahoma Land Run as a story of heroism. Many people have. It is possible to tell it as a story of theft. Others have done that too. Both stories are incomplete. The honest telling is the one that holds both at once, the courage and the cost, the democracy of the Homestead Act and the violence of the Indian removal, the free-for-all ride and the unfree treaties that made the ride possible. The full story of the run is the story of a nation that wanted the land and took it and gave it away by the 160 acres and remembered the giving and forgot the taking. The stakes the riders drove into the prairie on April 22nd are, most of them, long since rotted away. The claims have passed to heirs, or to buyers, or to corporations, or back to the state. But the country the stakes marked is still there. It is Oklahoma, and the men and women who live on it today, the descendants of the Boomers and the Sooners, of the black families from Langston and Boley, of the European immigrants, of the Creek and Seminole and Cherokee and Chickasaw and Choctaw, and the dozens of other nations whose lands made the state, carry, whether they know it or not, the weight of every decision that was made on that day. That weight has to be carried honestly. That is the work of history. That is, in the end, what we are doing here. If this story moved you, leave a like so others can find it. Thanks for spending time with Western Pioneer Archives.